I'm Afshin Ratansi, and this is Going Underground, swimming against the current of the mainstream every Monday, Wednesday and Saturday. Coming up in our end-of-season Easter special. With 59 Tomahawk missiles, has Donald Trump finally become a true American president? Legendary journalist and filmmaker John Pilger tells us how close we are now to a nuclear war. And after the scrapping of UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson's trip to Moscow this week, are London-Moscow relations headed for catastrophe? Plus,
and like rivers run into the sea,
destroy the lives.
They will unite as one.
In their eyes.
Black rage from a band blacklisted by the American counterintelligence program COINTELPRO, The Last Poets. All this and more coming up in our last show of this season. So, who would have predicted that all it would take for NATO nation liberal media to fall in love with US President Donald Trump would be 59 Raytheon Tomahawk missiles being launched at one of the most impoverished countries in the world? Someone who might is our next guest. Award-winning journalist and filmmaker John Pilger has made more than 60 documentaries. His latest, The Coming War on China, details the greatest military build-up since the Second World War by the United States against China. He joins me now from Sydney in Australia. Yeah. John, welcome back to Going Underground. The world is celebrating Easter, a crucifixion in Palestine. What do you make of the fact that the UK-backed Israeli government is telling the UN that Gaza faces a humanitarian crisis?
Well, it's about the suppression of truth. It's about double standards. It's about the kind of moral disregard that is the hallmark of our governments. It's the hallmark of many governments, but those that always pretend to uphold all those Christian values that are embodied in Easter are the ones that also uphold a kind of incandescent hypocrisy. Gaza is, as is often said, an open prison. The people there are the inmates, and their prison guards are the State of Israel. The State of Israel is the world champion in breaking international law. There's no country that really matches it, and yet, almost laughably, it calls itself a democracy. Its courts now say that it's okay to plant colonies right in the heart of the West Bank. And this is Easter. And I think if we're going to remember anything at Easter, we should remember that the people of Gaza should not be forgotten by us.
You mentioned the breaking of law there, certainly in the media here. Not many people mentioning that Donald Trump could have arguably broken the law with these missile strikes on Syria. Were you aware of any ironies that had happened while he was having dinner with President Xi Jinping in Florida?
I've no doubt, though I don't have first-hand evidence, of course, that that's the way it was planned. It was to send a message to the president of China, particularly over North Korea, that unless you haul in your friends in Pyongyang, and of course they're not, especially the friends of the Chinese, but unless you do something about that, we might fire a few missiles over there too. It'll be rather different, that of course, because the missiles could then open up a world war with a nuclear power. At the very least, it would probably destroy one of America's closest allies or supplicant states, South Korea. But that's how I read that.
What do you think of the reports, unnamed sources, of course, in the US media, blandly telling us that certainly the idea of nuclear weapons deployment in South Korea by the Trump administration is on the table, as is the possibility, according to NBC News, the possibility of assassination of Kim Jong-un of North Korea as a strategy?
Yeah, they call it the decapitation of the state. The possibility, the contingency, if you like, of using nuclear weapons has been on the table well before Trump. It was in the dying days of the Obama era that Congress quietly took out the word limited from nuclear war. The Pentagon's Law of War manual makes it very clear that it reserves the right to attack first with nuclear weapons. The air-sea battle plans for war with China are really about, as it says, conducting a blinding attack. It uses the word blinding on China just so that they don't attack the United States with nuclear weapons. And that blinding attack, of course, would very quickly escalate to nuclear weapons. The kind of discussion, in the 1980s that people regarded as a real threat to the existence of humanity, when 1 million people filled the streets of Manhattan as part of the Freeze movement. We had the Greenham Common women making their point in the most vivid way about not having nuclear weapons based anywhere near their homes and families, and outlawing nuclear weapons. All this is so contrary to how the world, ordinary people, when I say ordinary people, how the majority of sane humanity actually thinks. And we had a very striking example of that recently when historically a majority, a very overwhelming majority of the members of the General Assembly voted to outlaw nuclear weapons. And of course, the nuclear powers opposed it, and their vassal states like Australia and one or two others went along with that. But the point was, and we must not forget this, that the majority of humanity have made that move. Nuclear weapons will be illegal. That would make it quite difficult then for the moralizing, the crocodile tears, the double standards coming out of Washington and London and Tel Aviv and wherever.
But don't you think the reaction of Russia and China to the US military attack on Syria will embolden Donald Trump? I mean, all we heard was words. The Chinese saying that the British ambassador to the UN, Matthew Rycroft, was abusing the Security Council, that he condemned him for distorting China's position. Russia, of course, similarly making statements saying that this is bad for any type of peace in Syria. There's no actual threat that Donald Trump feels, though, surely.
Well, the Security Council now is a sort of a theatre of abuse. We have the absurd performance by the US representative at the United Nations with her photographs, completely bereft of any historical irony that Colin Powell had done exactly the same thing in 2003. Abuse, they know that abuse will become media headlines. Look, if I'm to speculate, I think Trump fired those missiles in order to save his political skin. There was a suggestion, which was becoming something of a political threat to him, that he might end up being impeached. The movement against him within the US establishment by everyone from the Central Intelligence Agency to the NSA to the State Department, and of course the overwhelming majority of the media, the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment, was such that in his own political terms, he had to do something. So why not do what every American president does, and I don't exaggerate, every American president in living memory has attacked some country in some form in order to establish his credentials. It was interesting to hear the former Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton weigh in and said, well, he really should have attacked all the airfields in Syria. So it's a festival of war. Trump used that, I believe, to save his political skin. He also used it to send messages, confused messages perhaps, to China, and he was about to see the Chinese president, as we've discussed. It has been pointed out to him that China and Russia are probably closer in a very positive sense than they have been for a very long time in development, one with resources, the other with such a massive industrial manufacturing base. It's almost Mao's dream. That's what Mao wanted for China and the United States. China and Russia have never been closer, and closer militarily. There's no question about that, doing military exercises together. So Trump is trying a bit of old Nixon manipulation to divide them. Whether or not he will, I don't know. It's very difficult to know with Trump. So much appears to being made up as he goes along, but there is a consistency about it. It's not all that different from Obama. Trump is a slightly unpredictable cartoon version of his predecessors.
Thanks, John. More from John Pilger after the break. Plus, Sir Tony Brenton, Britain's former ambassador to Moscow, tells us whether UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson can be trusted not to provoke all-out war with Russia.
Grenades in their eyes.
Grenades in their eyes.
Death is their prize.
Death is their prize.
Peace will arise.
Peace will arise.
Destroy the lie.
Destroy the lie.
And revolutionary music from the godfathers of hip-hop, the last poets. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. I'm joined again by award-winning journalist, author and filmmaker John Pilger. John, mainstream media here are telling us that it's Russia and China that are the nations isolated in the New World Order.
Isolating Russia has been a kind of overarching policy since 1917, 1918. The United States has regarded Russia as absolutely the enemy, the so-called enemy of Russia, as key to sustaining NATO. NATO needs the enemy of Russia. That's why there was so much hysteria about Trump when it was suggested that he was going to do some peace deals. He was going with Vladimir Putin. He was going to talk to Putin. That was the one glimmer of hope with the coming of the Trump era. Perhaps that will still be the case. Everything seems to have been turned on its head now with Trump attacking a country that he said he'd never attack. He said he had no interest in regime change in Damascus. Now he has. That seems to be the policy. But is it? I don't think we should wait around to find out. People do have a voice, and I would suggest that all those people who went into the streets to condemn, understandably, Trump as the coming of a new kind of fascist and calling for his impeachment, many of whom are now absolutely delighted he's attacked the wicked Assad. Perhaps they may see that their voice, a world voice, is needed to prevent the kind of nuclear wars that we are beckoning, it seems, both with Russia and with China.
Did it surprise even you how Donald Trump went from being an enemy himself, maybe because of what he said about NATO, to suddenly becoming as one CNN anchor said, the real president of the United States in launching those missile strikes?
I've been reasonably confident all along that he would be another American president. And that has certain responsibilities. Responsibilities, first of all, to threaten and to attack, and that he's done. You must remember that the Tomahawk missile has been used by other presidents, used famously by Bill Clinton. It was used by President Bush the first, certainly by his son, George W. Bush. You can send your ships into the eastern Mediterranean and hurl them at a country and kill people without having your own people killed. It's almost a presidential weapon. So we've been waiting for the Tomahawks, and here they are. So perhaps Trump now has to be really regarded by serious people as not just a rather grotesque comic, but another American president. And all the consistencies that exemplifies, that term, war, or as Martin Luther King said, it's just over 50 years since Martin Luther King made his wonderful speech in which he drew together the issues of the civil rights movement and the issues of war against, in this case, against Vietnam. And he described the United States as the greatest perpetrator of violence in the world. He wasn't talking about the American people. He was talking about the monoliths that run that country. And here we've had a demonstration of it again.
John Pilger, thank you. So, could UK Prime Minister Theresa May learn from mistakes in Iraq and Libya and break away from convention by not being the USA's poodle? Following the cancellation of UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson's trip to meet his counterpart Sergei Lavrov and Johnson's failed attempt to impose further sanctions on Russia at the G7 in Italy, we went to the Going Underground media hub to link up to Languedoc in France and talk with Britain's former ambassador to Russia, Sir Tony Brenton. Former Ambassador, thanks so much for being on Going Underground again. John Pilger just told us about the possibility of World War III. Do you think Theresa May is doing enough to stop it?
Well, I'm sure she's as worried about the prospect as everyone else is. I mean, undoubtedly, relations between Russia and the West have grown very tense over the last few months, notably over Syria. We've seen a very conspicuous recent example of that. And we remain very keen to try and get the tensions down. The problem is that, as you know, there's been a very sharp disagreement about the chemical attack that we believe the Assad regime carried out, which has confirmed, I'm sure, her views, because she's been in touch with President Trump about all of this, and Britain's views more generally, that the Syrian problem is not soluble as President Assad is in power.
OK, but talking about diplomacy, I mean, how wise of a defense secretary saying, Sir Michael Fallon saying, that Russia was to blame for every civilian death in Syria? What do you make of that kind of statement?
I think he overstated it. I mean, I think I would put it this way. My view is, and I've made this public, there's not a lot of point in us shouting at Russia, or indeed in Russia shouting at the West about what's going on in Syria. What is important is quiet, backstage contacts to establish common ground, and then on the basis of that common ground, to work together to find a solution. We believe that that solution will necessarily include Assad departing. Russia does not, or not in so many words. But the main point is to get together, and as actually Sergei Lavrov said in his press conference with Rex Tillerson, to get the Syrian people themselves involved in the process, to identify their own political future.
But focusing on British-Russian relations, I mean, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson may think what you just said was true, but he said we have to be tough with Russia, we cannot normalise relations, and obviously he cancelled his trip to Moscow.
Yeah, no, I think that was a mistake. I think, as I've said, it's important that we continue talking to each other. I think it's important that Russia be part of the solution. And I think it's important, therefore, that instead of shouting at Russia, we get together with Russia quietly to, as I say, identify common ground and see if there's a way forward.
Do you think Boris Johnson cancelling that trip is removing Britain from the world stage, as it were?
Well, I wouldn't put it that strongly. I think it was a mistake that he didn't go, because he could usefully have made the trip, have met Sergei Lavrov, and have reported, as it were, direct from the horse's mouth to the G7. Now, actually, given what has just happened between Tillerson and Lavrov, that probably wouldn't have made a huge amount of difference. But it would have introduced a degree of realism into the G7 discussions, which might have made that a more useful event.
But do you think Boris Johnson going to the G7 in Italy and saying, I'm going to hit Russia hard with sanctions, and then failing miserably, means that Britain really is losing any kind of name on the international stage? The G7 powers, let alone after Brexit, can basically ignore Britain now.
Again, I think you're drawing a rather extreme conclusion from one particular event. Boris Johnson did go there with the desire to introduce more sanctions. He did not succeed in persuading his G7 colleagues of that, and that is unfortunate. I think the real mistake, actually, was in letting the world know that he was trying to do this, rather than phoning quietly around beforehand to see how likely it was that the sanctions would be adopted.
But you wouldn't have done it, would you?
Sorry, just to finish. I don't think Russia should be under any illusions. If the sort of brutality we have seen in Syria over the last couple of weeks is repeated, then I think the call for sanctions and for other sort of action that the United States just took last week will increase. And that's a real worry for all of us.
But we heard from Rex Tillerson that sanctions were not threatened against Russia at this week's meetings. And would you have gone in knowing full well that a third maybe of Germany's oil comes from Russia? Would you go into a meeting expecting sanctions to be signed off in the G7?
There are people who believe that the only way to shift Russia is by external pressure. I think they're wrong, but I find it very worrying, really, that Russia is acquiescing. I mean, let's be quite clear about this. There is no doubt on our side that it was Assad who carried out the chemical attack.
On Britain's side, despite no international investigation.
Not only on Britain's side, but in the West generally, if I can.
NATO nation.
And the evidence is very strong. And we are left, of course, Russia was the country which midwifed the agreement, which notionally removed all chemical weapons from Syria. So one would have expected Russia to be very concerned at this apparent flagrant breach of that agreement. And we would be looking for cooperation from Russia in making sure that that flagrant breach was appropriately dealt with.
Who is Matthew Rycroft, the British envoy to the United Nations, who has incurred the wrath not only of the Russian envoy to the UN Security Council, but also China's?
Well, I happen to know him very well because I worked with him in Washington a few years ago. He's a very able British diplomat. What able diplomats do is speak for their countries, and he has spoken very eloquently about the really very brutal and nasty things in particular that have been going on in Syria recently.
Because, of course, he has form on weapons of mass destruction. He's named, I have volume 2, you can't see over there, the Chilcot report, and here he is on page 59, Rycroft's record of a meeting noting that military action seems inevitable, and President Bush wanted to remove Saddam through military action justified by the conjunction of WMD and terrorism, but the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. He seems absolutely certain that...
2 points here. The note taker writes down what other people think, not what he thinks. And the second point is that, of course, at that time, we all, British, French, Russian, Americans, all believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction.
But of course, the Russian envoy complained about abusive behavior, that he wasn't even behaving like a proper envoy to the UN Security Council, as did China.
I think there's been a lot of complaints by some UN ambassadors about other UN ambassadors. Russia's late ambassador in the UN, a very able man, but really did rile up some of his Western colleagues.
But I'm not sure. I mean, Russia's envoy at the moment, Savronkov, said that Rycroft is telling lies.
Well, again, I can't comment on the particular details. That sounds to me like exactly the sort of violent rhetoric that the UN sometimes produces.
But they are cooperating
So
with an
far,
investigation.
We have not seen such cooperation, and I think that's a pity.
But I thought they are cooperating on an investigation. They're just not cooperating with conclusions being jumped at, like Iraq.
No, I agree with you. And if the investigation can be made sufficiently objective, then we'll see if it validates our picture of what happened or the Russian picture of what happened. Now, if it validates our picture of what happened, then it will be very interesting to see the Russian government's reaction following that.
Former Ambassador Sir Tony Brenton, thank you. And that's it for the show. That's it for the season. We'll be back on Saturday, the 29th of April. In the meantime, get in touch via social media. We'll see you soon. And here are political activists and enemies of the state, the last poets, to play us out with Black Rage.
Grenades in their eyes.
Grenades in their eyes.
Death is their prize.
Death is their prize.
Peace will arise.
Peace will arise.
Destroy the lies.
Destroy the lies.
Grenades in their eyes.
Grenades in their eyes.
Death is their prize.
Death is their prize.
Peace will arise.
Peace will arise.
Destroy the lies.
Destroy the lies. Grenades in their eyes.
Soon they will see their beauty
Destroy the lies.
and know their strength.
Grenades in their eyes.
And like rivers run into the sea,
Destroy the lies.
they will unite as
Grenades in
one.
their eyes.
Then our
Grenades
voices
in their eyes.
will be more powerful
Grenades
than
in
a
their
gun.
eyes.
And when we
Destroy the
speak,
lies.
we'll get
Grenades
things
in their
done.
eyes.
Grenades
Destroy
in their
the
eyes.
Grenades in their eyes.
Death is their prize.
Death is their prize.
Peace will arise.
Peace will arise.
Destroy the lies.
Destroy the lies.
Grenades in their eyes.
Grenades in their eyes.
Death is their prize.
Death is their prize.
Peace will arise.
Peace will arise.
Destroy the lies.
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 Destroy the lies.